probably about 1900 or something like that, somewhere around that date. And he couldn't speak English, he could only speak Swedish. So he went to Worcester, Mass, where there were a lot of Swedes in Worcester. And my mother, she came over here she was born in Oban, Scotland. And she was a little bit younger than my father, and she came over, and her sister and brother had already immigrated to South Boston from Scotland. And of course, as you know, anybody that's ever been around South Boston, it's a very heavily Irish-Scotch section. And of course, at the time that the Irish mainly and the Scots came over here, they were considered, there were so many of them coming over here from the potato famine and different things. They were the NIGGERS of that town. I can't use that word because it's not politically correct. And the only work they could get to do was, menial work. And of course, the Swedes in Worcester were the same way. My father started out as a laborer. My mother, I don't know what she did, but one unique thing about it was my mother graduated from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And my father had a 5th grade education. And we could never understand how they got together. And of course, my father would never tell us, so we were out of luck there. So anyway, about I went to the 1st grade at AMIHS school. And my teachers were Miss Leslie Parrish and Miss Kathleen Jones. And we called them Miss Leslie and Miss Kathleen. This was before Lena Phelps. And then all of a sudden my mother developed leukemia after my brother was born. And she had to go to Tampa for radiation and chemotherapy. Believe it or not, they had it back then. But it was kind of in its primeval stage. So she was sent to Harvard Medical School in Cambridge, Mass. And she went through a treatment there, and they killed her up there. But I mean, at that time, they thought they were doing it good. And later on, a girl that worked for me got the same thing. And her doctor told her they just started doing chemotherapy in the early 50s. And she died too. And I told her, before she died, I said, well, tell Dr. I won't mention his name because he's a friend of mine. He's full of baloney. They were doing that up in Harvard Medical School back in the late 20s and early 30s. So we moved. My father, of course, when my mother was in the hospital there, he was working for Stone Webster. And the reason he got down to this island here was because he was working for D.P. Davis over in Davis Islands, Tampa. He was working with them. He was what they call a pusher for them. In other words, he was in charge of laborers. The Italians and the Irish and the Swedes were the shovelers, and he got up, he could have a louder voice than anybody else, I guess, and he was a pusher for them. And he tried to make a living here. Of course, he couldn't make a living here. And then, of course, the stock market crash came, and what little money he had, he lost every cent he had because he believed in stocks. He didn't have that much, but he had a heck of a time holding on to this house. I'll never forget that, because he had to get a 2nd and 3rd mortgage on the house from some friends of his to even hold on the house, because he had a mortgage on the house when he first bought it through McDonald. And I don't know whether Mitch Davis owned it or whether McDonald owned it or somebody else owned it, but it was a newer house. And of course, I was talking to Dora Welch a while ago, and she said a lot of people don't realize that there were people that lived across the street from there that had a little store and everything named McKinney. And I said, yeah, well, I remember because that woman brought me into the world. Of course, I didn't remember bringing me in the world. But she told me later that she'd done that and nursed me. And then my mother died up in Cambridge, and they buried her up there. And my father had left us with a maid man in South Boston who ran a little tobacco, candy, newspaper, and she lived upstairs. And in fact, I went back to South Boston about 15 years ago, and those places are still there. 897 East State Street, South Boston. And I didn't stop to see who was living there or anything. There were no blacks in there. There was still no white. And somebody told me they'd gone partial black, but I don't think so, unless it's just gone. But anyway, we lived there, and then my father moved over I was living with my aunt in South Boston, and I went to the first or the second grade in South Boston. And my father was living over in Passaic, New Jersey, with a Dutch couple, the Infels. And my stepmother was their daughter. And would you guess it, my father decided he had a couple of kids living with his sister-in-law, and he wanted to get married, so he got married to Maud Holmes, who, as you probably know, lived on the island here for 54 years. She died in 1988. Then, I'll never forget, he came up to South Boston, and he had a real speed wagon. It was second-hand. And we got all loaded up, and, you know, they had big running boards, and the stuff was tied on the top and was tied on the sides. And we came down the Blue Ridge Parkway. Right from the Blue Ridge Parkway was about the time it was built. When the church was built. And I remember it took us between 7 and 8 days to get from South Boston to Anna Maria Island. And we arrived here, and I went to the 3rd grade here in Anna Maria. And about that time was when Lena Phelps came out here. I think she came out here in 33 or 34. But when I went to school in the 1st grade, it was Leslie Parrish, who was later Leslie Parrish Davis. She married Bill Davis. She lived right next door to the school. That was Bill Davis's first wife, and the house burned down later. And then Bill remarried. I don't know whether any of y'all know Bill or not. And I don't know whatever happened to Leslie Parrish, but I never heard about it again. But anyway, Kathleen Jones married a fellow named Donovan, and of course she lived here for many years. And she lived down near where the Catholic Church is. Now, all that Catholic Church property, a lot of it at one time, belonged to Captain Jones, and then Kathleen Jones Donovan, and then finally, I think Donovan was crippled or something. I think he had something on his leg or something. But then they called it Jones Bayou. It was called Jones Bayou down there. It wasn't called Sportsman or whatever it was called. I can't remember. But and of course, I think, if I remember correctly, when Kathleen died, she left most of that land, the Catholic Church land, to the Catholic Church, if I remember correctly. And so then I went through the 3rd grade here, through the 6th, and of course, as Redora will tell you, and anybody else that was down here then, they had a hard time every year getting enough kids to go to school. There was 6 grades. And if I remember correctly, when I was in the 3rd grade, there was only about 12 or 15 of us in the school, and Redora had already left. And I don't know whether KB was in the school or not. Probably he might have just left. But there weren't too many kids running loose. And then we stayed there till the 6th grade. And then we went in town, and we went to Biltmore High School, Manatee High School today, in the 7th grade. And then the next year they opened back up, or again, or whatever, Walker Junior High, or we call it Walker. We went over there in the 8th grade, then we came back in the 9th grade to Manatee High School, which by that time was called Braden High School. It wasn't called Manatee High School. And then, of course, when I left there, in fact, it was still Braden High School when I left there. So then I went into service in 1943 and served 3 years in the Army. I went in on May the 8th, 1943. I'm looking for my birth certificate here, copy. And all the boys that I grew up with, Junior Crandall, Bill Stewart, Corey Chambers, Harold Phillips, George Phillips, all the boys I grew up with, well, George didn't quit school early, but all the other boys quit school early and went in service. And of course, their father had to sign for them. If you were under 18, your father had to sign for you. And my father wouldn't sign for me. I wanted to go in, but he wouldn't sign. I was the only boy in my class that graduated from high school, because everybody else went into service. And on May the 8th, 1943, I went into service. I got through high school. In fact, I graduated that year on April the 30th, and by May the 8th, I was in service. And I stayed in there for 3 years. Spent a year in France and Germany, actually North Africa, France and Germany, but when I was in combat in North Africa, they'd already pulled out of North Africa. It was a staging area. I went into Normandy about 3 weeks after D-Day. During D-Day, they had brought us back from Africa because we were supposed to go into Italy. they had brought us back from Africa and sent me to mine school in southern England, at Salisbury, England. And we were stationed at Western Supermare, and we all wanted to go over in D-Day, but they wouldn't let us go because we weren't out of school, and I'm glad I didn't go now. But anyway, we got over there finally, and I managed to be in the hospital for about 8 weeks before it was over. Then when I got out of the service in 1946, I came back here to the island, and which means I was, for the 70 years of age, I've spent 1 year in South Boston, 3 years in service, and another 66 years on Enemy Island. However, today, I spend 6 months in the mountains, and I spend 6 months in the island. So I'm still a legal resident, but in the summertime, my heart's in the mountains. And of course, I know people here that love the mountains in the summertime. It's beautiful. And there's a lot of Scots in the mountains, too. The fishermen here, a lot of Scots, and there are a lot of Scots in the island, and a lot of Scots in the mountains. They're all over the place, you know. But then when I first came home, I went to work for State Farm Insurance Company as an insurance agent, and starved to death. So that didn't last very long, because my sister-in-law worked for State Farm. So I went up to Bloomington, Illinois, and took a course and became a State Farm agent. I sold my brother and my father, and I didn't have any cousins, and my father's partner, and then I ran out of customers. Because in the insurance business, it takes a long time to build up what they call, I guess still today, a debit. And when I ran through my relatives, I was out of business. So my father and Melvin Davis had been in the construction business since 1934. In fact, my father built the anchorage for Dewey Adams and Jim Hackney in 1935, the original anchorage. And at that time, Adams and Hackney was a lumber company, and they were in the lumber business. And my father built the anchorage for them. He actually did all the rough work. They finished it up themselves. And of course, you know what happened. I don't know if you know what happened to the anchorage or not, but it finally burned down and so forth. Then after Melvin and I went in business, we stayed in business for, I guess, well, till 48. 1948, that was what, 2 or 3 years. And I started selling a little paint and hardware on the side. And I think that's when you came down about that time, wasn't it? When I had home supplies. And I had a gas station. I sold milk. I sold bread. I had lumber. And Vidora's brother was in the lumber business over Manatee County Lumber. He was a big dealer. I was just a small dealer. And I had hardware. But I started out selling paints. And the next thing you know, my brother, Hugh, and Melvin went in business. And I went into the supply business. But at that time, it was the only store, so to speak, between Silver's Grocery and the Enemy IGA, you know. And of course, I wasn't really a store. I was more like a hardware store and lumber yard. And I stayed there until 1962, and I was one of the founders of Manatee Federal Savings and Loan Association in Braden, Florida. And we'd already hired 2 managers, and they didn't work out. They were professionals. And they asked me whether I wanted to come in there and do some appraising for the bank. And I said, heck, I'm not an appraiser. I mean, I've sold, you know, real estate, and I've sold lumber, and I've done contract, but I'm not an appraiser. So I was appraising for the bank and the VA. At that time, almost anybody could get an appraiser's certificate for the VA. I was amazed how easy it was to get one. So then I went to work in there as an appraiser and loan officer, and the next thing you know, I had an offer to buy out my business, which I won't go into any details, but it turned out rather badly. I lost about $12,000 in the deal. But by that time, I was firmly entrenched in the bank, and I was a loan officer and appraiser. And then we had another manager we got from Texas. I'll never forget him. He used to sit and read comic books during the day. And the girls told me about that. They said, his name was Boswell. He was from Temple, Texas. Said, Boswell reads comic books during the day. And I went over to his desk one day, and of course he was my boss now. And I looked over there, and sure enough, he was reading comic books. So I never said anything about it. But anyway, they fired him, and then they made me the manager. I didn't know anything about banking. The only background I had was in contracting, real estate, and lumber. But I did know all the contractors, and I did know all the real estate people. And because I'd done business with them otherwise, Francis Livingston, Gertie Blassingame, just to name a few. And when I first went to work in Manatee Federal, I was bringing in a lot of business off the island, where everybody on the island wanted it alone. That I knew them, they'd come to see me, and I was cranking out 5 or 10 loans a week off the island here, and we haven't had that many since. So they made me the manager, and I said, heck, I don't have a background. You've had 3 professionals in here already run the place that went through savings and loan, graduate school, and everything else, and I didn't even get out of college. Well, anyway, I stayed there for 17 years and retired as president 17 years ago, and never had any problems. But I had girls that worked for me that were savings and loan professionals. I mean, I didn't do it all myself. If it wasn't for those girls working for me, and the men too, I would have been in trouble. But all I was a guy, you know, when you go into a bank and you say, I got a problem. When I finally retired in 1979, I was at the position being president of the bank, and they'd say, you got a problem, you'll have to see Mr. Holmes. So all I was doing all day long was solving problems. People come in there raising hell about something, they'd say, you'll have to talk to Mr. Holmes, and if that was my job. And that wasn't too bad because it was pretty easy work, although I didn't like sitting behind the desk all the time. I was used to getting outside. And then the federal government moved in. This was before the crash of the savings and loans. I got out at the time. The government came in, and the examiners used to come in, and they'd go through our books and count the pennies and count the nickels and balance our books and everything, and all of a sudden we got into this modern, you know, truth in this, truth in that, no discrimination, female rights and all this stuff. And the examiners would come in there, and they'd always give us a notice. They'd say, well, we're coming in to examine you on January the 1st. So here are these guys that come in, most of them fresh out of college, most of the older ones were getting out. And they said, well, now I got to have this non-discrimination paper filled out. These, they had all kinds of names for them, you know, truth in lending, truth in credit, truth in this, truth in that. And they got through the examination. It took about 10 days, and I asked the head examiner, because I knew him from before, because he'd always balance my books and counted the pennies and everything. He said, oh, we don't do that anymore. I said, what do you mean you don't do that anymore? He said, this is a new era. He said, the politics have changed. He said, everything's different. So anyway, we went through about two or three examiners like that. They never once checked our books, never once balanced them, never once checked our loans, never did. Everything was equal rights for this and equal rights for that, and truth in advertising, truth in lending, truth in that. So I went through that for about 3 examinations for about 4 years, and I was not broke or anything, and I'd made some fairly wise investments. And I said, the hell with this. So when I was 54 years old, I retired. And somebody said, well, what'd you retire so early for? I was being well paid, very well paid, a lot more than I've made since. Paying taxes, petty taxes. They said, what do you want to put? I said, I can't take that anymore. I said, here these people coming in from the federal government are supposed to be balancing our books. And they're not even looking at our books. They're not looking at our loans or anything. 4 years later, roughly 3 to 4 years later, the bottom fell out of the savings loan business. It came home to roost. The sloppy federal government accounting, non-accounting procedures, with all these people with no discrimination and women's rights and men's rights. And I remember I hired a black girl one time. She was from, we had to have so many blacks and so many Hispanics and this. I hired this black girl from New York City. She was a Florida girl. I mean, when I hired her, I was very impressed with her, but she could tame it in New York City. She got a college degree. She came to work for me, and she fought with every customer that came in that place. Now, these were all local yokel rednecks or retirees. And these were our meat bread and potatoes. This was our living. And she'd get in a fight with every one of them. And I could never understand it. And I kept telling her, I said, look, you can't do that. You've got to, the customer's always right. When you tell them no, you smile. And she said, well, where I come from, New York City, she was originally a Florida girl. So I told this girl that was my head girl, I said, get rid of that girl. So we got rid of her, so she sued us. So we had to pay her off. So then they said, well, you've got to have a minority in here. So then we went looking for a Hispanic. We got a Hispanic girl, and she just graduated from the data processing degree from Manatee Junior College. And she was a real nice girl, and she got in there. There was only one problem, she couldn't count. Now, how we ever get stuck with her, I'll never know. She couldn't balance the day the other girls would have to balance for her. She couldn't have, everything, we were on a computer then, we were online on a computer. She couldn't balance on the computer, she couldn't balance on the ad machine. And I asked her, I said, what kind of degree did you have? She said, I got a degree in data processing from Manatee Junior College. And of course we had to let her go. And she threatened us. But we didn't, we just paid her off. Then they got on me again. This all happened in about a 4-year period. Then they said, well, you don't have any minorities. You're supposed to have 10% of your employees. So I hired a black man who just came back from Vietnam. And he was a good man, but he reached the height of his, he reached the height of the Peter principle. He got up so high and he just couldn't go any further. And he stayed with me till I retired, and guess what happened when I retired? 30 days after I retired, they fired him. Because he had a problem. He was a local boy. He was a good fellow. He was a Vietnam vet. But between all these things, between the not looking at the books and trying to force us to hire people that couldn't do the job, and then when this thing came about and the savings zones all started going belly up, somebody said, well, you got out at the right time. And I said, look, I couldn't take that anymore. I mean, it was a mess, as you all remember, like $130 billion or something, and still counting. And, but anyway, I retired, and I couldn't have taken that anymore. I mean, after about 4 years of that, I think there was 3 examinations in a 5-year period, and they never once looked at our books, never once checked a loan, or anything. And I could never understand who dreamt up that social revision stuff so fast, you know. And I don't want to accuse anybody because it was in the 70s, so that would be during. And incidentally, I voted for Jimmy Carter, and I thought he was a fine man. But this all happened during Jimmy Carter's administration, and I never blamed any of it on him, but the rest of the people that were in there at the time, they were going to change the world. You know, like Lyndon Johnson's Guns and Butter. And when Jimmy Carter got in there was equal rights for all, you know, and no book guns. So to get back to a few things I've got written down here, I've got 3. I look back and I've got 3 atlases at home. And I was just trying to figure out how much Anna Maria, now this is just the city of Anna Maria. In 1943, according to the 1943 Atlas, there were 131 people in the city of Anna Maria. That was the population. And of course I was one of them, I guess. 1956, there were 345 people in Anna Maria. 1980, there were 1,137 people in Anna Maria. And of course now there's more. This is, I didn't come up the last 16 years. But anyway, in a 37-year period, Anna Maria grew 9 times. And of course it's probably 10, 11 times now. Because I was driving around here the other day and I was amazed at how many new houses now are going up in Anna Maria. And everybody says, well, Anna Maria and Holmes Beach are all built out. Well, they better drive around the streets. There's a lot of construction going on here. Yeah. And I remember going back a little bit, I remember when we were going to Anna Maria school, we used to have, you know, y'all from the north all talk about how hard it was to go to school. Well, I lived 2.5 blocks from the school, and I had to walk through the sand spurs to get to school. So y'all weren't the only ones that had a problem. In fact, when we were kids, we had to walk everywhere. But a lot of us, when you got 12 years old, you got 2 things if you were a boy. You got a bicycle and a .22 rifle. And that was a rite of passage as a man. And of course, then you could ride around. And not too many people used cars out there. Then most of them had trucks or something. And even in our family, which was a little bit better off than most families, we only had 1 car. We didn't even have a truck. And my father made the car into a truck. And my mother didn't like that. In fact, that Rio Speed wagon, before we got a car, that was made into a truck. They chopped it off behind the cabin and put a bed on it. And it was a pretty good truck, too. And the things that I remember a lot is that, and Redora Welch remembers this too, but although I think she's 2 years older now. But we used to always on Sundays, my brothers and I, we used to work in the neighbors' yards. All the kids out here worked. There was no welfare. There was no handout. You either had to work or else you get the hell off the island and do something. I don't know what you did. But if you lived out in the island, you had to, and the kids, I remember we used to get 10 cents an hour for working in our neighbors' lawns. And of course, there were really no lawns out here. That meant pulling sand. That was working the lawn. And on Sunday morning, they started, my brother and I, my mother was an organist at the Rosen Memorial Church, and my father was a trustee of the Rosen Memorial Church. My father was one of the people that were instrumented with Marion Coleman and several others in reworking the Rosen Memorial Church. In fact, I was a charter member of whether we and I don't go to church anymore, but I guess I was technically still. But anyway, during the Depression, a lot of the houses around here were empty. There's nobody living in them. And the church in the early parts of the Depression was practically zilch, it was gone. And Marion Coleman and her mother, Lula Coleman, and my father and several other people reorganized the church. And my brother and I's jobs were, we got up early Sunday morning at dawn and we went down and cleaned out the church. We were janitors. Then the people came into Sunday school. We were ushers. Then at church, we took up the collection. Then when the people left church, that's probably the reason I don't go to church anymore. When we left at the end of church, then we had to pick up all the hymnals and everything and stack them up for the next week. And this was something, because my mother was an organist and my father was a trustee, we didn't think anything about it. And I think, if I remember correctly, we got $1.50 a week or something like that a piece, if I remember correctly. Something like 10 cents a month. But the church, of course, has prospered since, and my father built the first addition to the church. I think they call it a transept or something sticking out in the middle of it. One of the walls of the church was about to fall over, and they decided they had to do something. So he put in, I think they call it a transept. And there's so many additions been put on lately. But Dr. Butterfield, you were the minister for this. And then on Sunday afternoons, after we got through the churching, we went over and played either, in the spring we played baseball, in the fall we played football. Now when I say baseball and football, it was not organized, it was the neighbors. There was a place we called Fiddler Flats. It was right behind the youth center, down toward the bay. There was a big salt flat back there, and we used to call it Fiddler Flats. And we used to have baseball games in the spring, and we used to play Cortez, Palmasola, Parrish, Ellington, and so forth. You know, the football was 6-man football with no protection or anything. And of course, the baseball was baseball. In fact, I know Redora's brother played, because when I was a little kid, about 12 years old, he didn't show up for a game one day, and I had to play third base. He was a third baseman, and I was only 12 years old, and he was probably about 18. And I was scared to death somebody would hit me a ball. Nobody hit me a ball. So I was lucky. But I think I've run on a little long here, so unless you all got some questions or something. Incidentally, I want to introduce my son, Jack. This is my son, Jack. He's lived on 45 years, and he would have been born on the island, but by the time he was born, everybody had to be born in Brady. So we had no choice. Unless somebody's got some questions, well. Go ahead, yes ma'am.
Did you go barefooted?
Yes ma'am, in the summertime we had one pair of shoes a year. And we wore that to school. And in the summertime we went barefooted with shorts and no shirts. And we looked like a bunch of pickaninnies. We've got some pictures. And that's one reason that I've had problems with skin cancer and cataracts all my life, because we looked like a bunch of pickaninnies running around. And all the kids did this. My mother would not allow us in the summertime to wear shoes. Now later on we had like these flip-flops, these pads. But we had, well, our feet had calluses on them that thick. Go ahead.
Maybe you could relate to the audience with something prior to air conditioning, how you live.
Right. Well, prior to air conditioning, and Roe will remember this, the electricity wasn't too sure out here, And we had kerosene stoves, we had ice boxes, and we had fire. We had a fireplace in our house. We burned firewood, and in the summertime it was awful hot here, and it was awful stuffy. And all the houses had screen porches on the front of them around it, and our house had a ceiling exhaust fan. In the top of the house, we had a 2-story house, and it pulled the air in from all around. But when in the summertime, the mosquitoes were so thick out here then that even in the middle of the day, you could look at the screen door and you walk out and it's full of mosquitoes, and you'd walk outside and the mosquitoes would walk off with you. So the way we had to keep them cool was at night we used to go down and sit on the Anna Maria dock, and during the daytime we'd go down around the Anna Maria Pavilion, which is where the sandbar is now, and we'd go swimming up there. Because, of course, we didn't know any better, because we didn't get air conditioning here on the island until the 50s, And everybody said that anybody that stayed on the island in the summertime had to be either a mad dog or an Englishman. Of course, my father was a Swede, my mother was a Scot. But it didn't make any difference. People thought people were crazy to live here in the summertime, and they were. But we didn't know any better, So it was, they say those were the good old days. Well, I'll tell you, these are the good old days. Whenever anybody tells me about those are the good old days, I say you're full of baloney. Because these are the good old days. Now the young people don't believe that. They say, Daddy used to walk out and used to walk across the mullet on the Anna Maria dock, which the mullet used to be thick out there, and we catch all we wanted because we lived in mullet and grits most of the time. That was standard fare. And everybody had a garden, almost everybody. Everybody had chickens, and they more or less lived off the land, but mullet was standard fare. And of course today the fishing is not as good as it used to be, but there's a lot more. Of course, there was no talking about conveniences. K.B. Kimball had the first television set on Anna Maria Island, and he ran Manatee Lumber Company. And as soon as K.B. got his television set, I was jealous, and I had the second television set. I'll never, because K.B. was a good friend of mine, and I'll never forget that. And I went down to K.B.'s house, and he had a rotor up there, and you could get Jacksonville. That was before Channel 38 in St. Pete. You could get Jacksonville, I think it was Channel 4. And he'd turn it to Jacksonville, and you'd see, well, y'all remember this, where you were. You'd see this clouds and smoke, and every once in a while you'd hear a word. So I thought that was the most wonderful thing. Because our thing at night was listening to the radio, small radio. Of course, we listened to Bob Hope and George Burns and Charlie McCarthy and Amos and Andy. And of course, that's another thing that always fascinates me is you can't even listen to Amos and Andy anymore. And they've thrown away all their films. And Amos and Andy were whites anyway. But because they had a black face, now it's unfashionable to watch them. But that was some of the funniest humor that there ever was. And why that had to be relegated to the ash pile, I could never understand. Yes, ma'am.
Where was your shop in?
You know where Holmes Beach Business Center is? You know where Hugh Holmes Construction is? Hugh Holmes Jr. is my nephew. In order of sequence, Holmes and Davis was where Hugh Holmes' place is. My place was where the parking lot is. And my father had his real estate office over on the right-hand side. And my father also at that time had a real estate on the old Cortez Bridge, where, you know where the Drift Inn is? Do they still call it the Drift Inn? So, well, anyway, he had a real estate office there too. He had 2 real estate offices at one time. I don't know how he did it, because there wasn't that much business. But at that time, there was Chris Kachutis and Annie Silver and my father and H.B. Miller, and then later, of course, Gertie Blast and David Francis Livingston. And there was quite a and then later Dick Wagner. There was quite a thing there, you know. The real estate man, customer would come on the island. It was kind of like when I went to Brevard, North Carolina. I walked in there and they saw my Florida license plate, and I had 3 or 4 people come out there, offered to take me to dinner and everything. And it was almost that bad down here, not quite as bad. But I remember whenever Chris Kachutis sold a house or lot, or Francis Livingston, or H.B. Miller, or Annie Silver, my father, he didn't sleep that night because he should have made that sale. It was very competitive.
How about a police department? Did they have a police department?
We had quite a few police departments. When I was here in the in the 30s and 40s, we had no police department. We had the sheriff's department. And the reason I remember we had the sheriff's department is when I was about 13 or 14 years old, Corey Chambers and my brother and I and Bill Stewart, we used to hang around together. We broke into a house and broke out some of the windows and broke the light bulbs in the house. I could never understand why we did it. And Roy Baden was sheriff. And he later worked for me for 10 years. And some of the neighbors saw us break into the house, you know, vandalism. And they called the cops, and Roy came out to our house. And of course, Hugh and I got a tanning, and Bill got a tanning, and Corey didn't get a tanning. We always blamed him on Corey. Corey's still alive, Bill's dead now. But we had to work it out and pay back that damage. But the damage was breaking a couple of windows and breaking the light bulbs. And I never could understand why we didn't ransack the house. It never made any sense to me, but that's the last house I broke into. Then after World War II, of course, we had the sheriff's department, just like they have now. Then we had a succession of people, I don't remember all their names. I remember George Jordan in particular. Because his main job was, I think he was a retired New Jersey policeman, if I remember correctly. His main job was, the mayor, who is dead now, was a friend of mine, Bill Breyer, used to like to take a drink or two. And George's main job was to sit up here in front of the post office, and when Bill would come out of the sandbar, to tell him he couldn't drive his car and take his keys away from him and drive him home. That seemed to be his main job. I mean, there weren't too many crimes, so to speak, committed out here. I mean, people more or less looked after each other. Compared to, I don't think there's as much crime today as people say there is. But, people in a small town, and if y'all, I'm sure that y'all have lived in small, people more or less take care of themselves. I mean, their own. And up there where I was in the mountains, I hate to push the mountains. Those people around there, you know, they all got guns. And everybody around here used to have guns too. And up there, if you broke into somebody's house in the neighborhood I lived into, and if you were a stranger, you'd either get shot, you'd get run off, or the cops would be up there in about 5 or 10 minutes. And these are county cops, see, these are not, because we're out on the mountain. The people were very, you know, the neighborhood watch concept. People down here or up there aren't afraid to call the cops. Because when we broke into that house, the next door neighbor called the cops, and they came all the way out here from Braden. They didn't catch us breaking in. But they figured who it was, because there's only about 6 or 7 boys, you know, around here, so it had to be someone, you know. Yes, sir.
When did Holmes Beach, the city, become Holmes Beach?
Holmes Beach became Holmes Beach in 1950. And people always have said to me, they say, well, your father was the founder of Holmes Beach. My father was not the founder of Holmes Beach. Carl Francis Carroll was the founder of Holmes Beach. And the reason Holmes Beach was founded was because Halsey Titchener, Max Ingham, because of zoning, they wanted it zoned. Because my father owned a good portion. Peter Michelson and my father owned most of the land. And they, of course, they had more. They owed money. They had to sell it to pay their taxes and interest. But Francis Carroll was really the founder of Holmes Beach, but of course he didn't want Carroll Beach. But Francis Carroll put in our first water system. And he wanted it all controlled to one unit, one governmental unit. And Halsey Titchener and Max Ingham wanted the zoning. So everybody got together, and we got down at the AMIHS school. AMIHS school had just been built, and we had a meeting. And they were talking about they were going to name it Cobb Beach, because Anna Rouse Cobb was there. Although she was not in the original Holmes Beach, she lived across the street from me. She said, "Well, because it was original Cobb Homestead where most of the property was." But Mrs. Rice on the First National Bank of Bradenton had foreclosed on her property in the 30s because she couldn't pay her taxes. And my father was buying it from Mrs. Rice in the First National Bank of Bradenton, $1 down, $1 a week. In other words, every time he wanted a lot, he had to pay so much money to take it out and pay off the bank. And then somebody said, well, how about Palm Beach? And I'll never forget this because I don't remember who it was, but they said, oh, there is already a Palm Beach in Florida. They said, well, how about Palm City? That was the next one. And finally, Francis Carroll, he was the chairman of the meeting. He got up there and he banged his gavel and he says, what's wrong with Holmes Beach? There were only about 20 of us at the meeting. My father didn't even live in Holmes Beach. My brother, his wife, and me and my wife, and 16 other people were the only people that could vote at this meeting. And that's in round numbers, I don't know. Redora said she thought it was 30, maybe it was 30, but I still think it was close to 20. But anyway, Francis Carroll said, what's wrong with Holmes Beach? And 2 or 3 of the people got real long looks in their face, like Anna Riles, who of course didn't even live in the area. And it was named Holmes Beach. Of course, my father was proud as a peacock because he owned more land in Holmes Beach than anybody else. And I was one of the first councilmen. There was Oscar Russell, Frank Giles, Halsey Titchener, Max Ingham, myself, and let's see, there was 5 aldermen. I don't remember who the other one was. I don't know whether Bouchel was an alderman in there, but Bouchel later became an alderman. And I served on the Holmes Board of Aldermen for 11 years. And somebody told me when you go into politics, when you're in business, you don't go into politics. It don't work. But I got by all right, but I agree with them that today is kind of dangerous to go into politics if you're in business, because I did lose some business over it, But I didn't worry too much about it because I figured I got along with everybody that was in the city council. But Francis Carroll was actually the founder of Holmes Beach. It was named for my father because he wanted to develop more land. He wanted a water system. Max Ingham and Halsey Titchener wanted zoning, and that's how Holmes Beach came about. And of course, at that time, he was building the airport, and incidentally, talking about the airport, when my brother and I got out of the service, we had the GI Bill coming to us. My brother had 3 years at Georgia Tech, and I had 6 months at NC State. My brother was in the Navy during the war and was in Georgia Tech, and I went to NC State. And after 6 months, they put a rifle in my hand, sent me to Fort Benning, and sent me overseas. And my brother, he was luckier. Of course, he probably got better grades than I did, because I played football some and he didn't. And that was probably one reason. But anyway, he and I, a fellow named Bob Gray came down here from Long Island. And my father wanted to, of course, the airport, he and Giles and Wimpy and Ruth Lavershiner, later Mahara, were the ones that more or less put in the airport. My father was the one that the basic one to put in the airport. But it wasn't all with his money. Francis Carroll had money in it, and Ray Perrine had some money in it for a while. And my brother and I, instead of going back to school, we flew out. We learned to fly off the Holmes Beach Airport. We flew away all our college time, which we wouldn't have used anyway, flying out of. So I became a pilot. The only problem was that there wasn't much market for private pilots, and because everybody and his brother was getting a pilot's license, and it would have cost me more money to go any further. Go ahead.
Where was this airport?
It was right down where the city office is now. You know where the Holmes Beach city office is now? In the fire department?
Oh, that big city one?
Yeah, big. Now the Holmes Beach airport, the main, we call that the main runway. And this, I want to get a plug in for my family on this one. You know, we donated all that land to the city of Holmes Beach. From the end of the boat basin all the way down to Shell Point there. My brother and I and Francis Carroll and Peter Michelson donated that to the city of Holmes Beach for nothing. We didn't get a penny. And the reason we donated to them, because we couldn't do anything with it. There's an airport, and they were closing out all these small airports because they didn't meet any kind of standards. And we were still paying taxes on it. And we got together one time, and I think it was Frank Giles said, "What the hell do we want to keep this airport for?" So we gave it to Holmes Beach. Holmes Beach original city office was in the back of my store the first year. Go ahead. Anybody else?
Something you never mentioned, John, that I remember very well how hard you worked with organizing the volunteer fire.
Okay. Well, that's something I'm glad you brought up. Josie's father and I were in business together, and I lived with Josie and her mother when I was working in the army camps in the first part of World War II. And we came back here, and her father and I and Benny Scanio and Ernie Cardina, and I probably missed somebody else, Jim Forrester, Red Commode, started the fire department. And her father was the first fire chief in Anna Maria, and he was a damn good one. And I was the first assistant fire chief. And we built a building down here. It didn't cost the taxpayers a penny. And this is a gripe I got. It didn't cost the taxpayers a penny. All the material was donated. All the labor was donated. Her father worked on it for weeks. I worked on it for weeks. My brother worked on it. And then 2 or 3 years ago, they tore the firehouse down. I could never understand that. Now, I don't blame them for tearing it down if they would have built something in its place, but there's still nothing in its place. And that building, regardless, that building was built, what was it, 46? Josie, 46, 47, about 46, about 47. That was a lot of labor of love, and it was a lot, kind of like the community, well, not community hall, community hall before I was born. Her father was the first, and this was all non-paid too. It was a volunteer fire department. Everything came out of your pocket, and you were trying to make a living. Right, it kept the first fire truck was kept in their garage. But I hate to see them tear down that firehouse because, like I said, if they would have, somebody said they were going to put a post office in there. Well, if they would have torn it down and put a post office, fine, but the lot is still sitting empty there, and they could have used that firehouse for something. There wasn't anything wrong with that building. That was a very well built. Of course, it blew up probably. But I worked in that fire department, and her father did for years and years. My brother worked in it, and my nephew worked in it, my son worked in it. Our whole family worked in that fire department for years. Anybody else?
I wanted to point out here we have a little display about Holmes Beach, and most of it is at the bottom.
Well, the one thing interesting, this is Seaside Gardens. One thing interesting about this, my father died when he was 85 years old, and I was working in Manatee Federal. And this was at the end of the airport. This was the land that we did not donate to the city on the side. My father came in to me one day and he said, "I want to borrow $1 million." I said, "For what?" He said, "I want to develop Seaside Gardens." He named all he needed. My father was a true developer. And I said, well, you can't borrow $1 million, you're 80 years old. He said, what do you mean? I said, are you sure you want to do it? He said, yes. So I made arrangements for him not to borrow from us, because we couldn't own it, to borrow from the 1990 bank, and he bought it. And needless to say, he built it out. And that was the last thing that he actually built out. But when he was 80 years old, and he was almost blind, he couldn't hardly walk. He borrowed $1 million to start CSAC, and somebody said, well, where'd all the money go to? Even back then, it cost a lot of money. See, this was all swamp. All this land was swamp then. Most of the houses that you people live on in this island today, including my own, were mangrove swamp years ago. And if you look at that Days Past book here this year, if you want to see what the island looked like years ago, just look through this book. There was very little vegetation out here except for sand spurs, cabbage pines, saw pines, cedar trees. What have I missed, Josie? Well, that was an exotic. Mangroves. And now you drive around and you see all these trees. My son came here from San Francisco about a month ago. He said, Daddy, he hadn't been here in 10 years. He said, there's so much greenery on the island. He said, I'll bet you it's like when you were a kid. I said, Billy, when I was a kid, there was very little greenery on the island. Very little, you know. It was, and if you look at this book, you can see how much it was on the island. There was very little. And now I understand that somebody in Anna Maria, and I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes here, is talking about getting rid of all the Australian pines. Well, that's a wonderful idea, except that when I was a kid, the Australian pines were the salvation of the army, of this island. If you asked me how we kept cool when I was a kid, everybody planted Australian pines because they grow fast for shade. And Australian pine, incidentally, is the best firewood there is in this part of the South. And a lot of people don't realize, they think they have to use oak. Australian pine. And they haul truckloads of Australian pine to the dump every day off this island and everywhere else. And this fellow in Anna Maria is going to get rid of all the Australian pines. Now he can get rid of the Brazilian peppers and the pump trees. But the Australian pines, if it wasn't for the Australian pines, you people wouldn't be living here today, and I wouldn't be living either. Because that was the only real shade tree we had outside of a few live oaks. And most of them had been cut down and the land had been farmed because they used to raise a lot of tomatoes out here back in the 30s. In fact, go ahead.
What kind of animals were out there?
Animals? Well, the real or imagined.
Were there alligators?
Oh yeah, there was a big alligator lived here right back of we used to call it the Gilman House. It's right, you know where Van Ostenbridge's place is? You know where the Islander Plain is?
Yeah.
Where the old Islander Plain is. Right behind there, there's a lake. There's a big alligator used to live there that we used to be scared to death of. And he used to get the neighbors. And the island, this island was loaded with rattlesnakes. Believe it or not, when I was a kid. But we didn't think too much of it. But there was a big alligator there, and there were other gators that went by here. There were also bobcats on the island. That was rather common. There were hundreds of coons.
Still is.
People used to trap coons. In fact, my brother and I used to go out and trap coons and skin them and put salt on them and ship the furs to Moser Fur Company. In St. Louis, we used to get $1.50 a piece for them. And we had to pay the postage. Howard Davis made a living, Rich Davis' son made a living trapping coons for several years. There were, well, like people say, there's a lot of coons here now, but the coons are, I don't know who's a coon lover here, but coons are kind of like anything else. They're very destructive. And of course, we never ate coon here. We never ate gopher tortoise. There was a lot of gopher tortoise out here then too. And a lot of little, what we call ground doves, little big doves. And up on the north end of the island, there were burrowing owls that actually lived in sand crab holes. They went in, they lived in sand crab holes. But the blacks that worked out here in the island, and most my brother and her father, and most of the contractors out there, we used blacks for labor, like in the early part of the century, the Irish were the labor. When I was growing up, the blacks were the labor. And they loved gopher, and they loved coons. So whenever we kill one, we take the pelt and hang it up and salt it and dry it out and ship it to Moser. And Howard, of course, he made a living doing it. And the blacks would take, and of course today, of course, you realize the gopher tortoise is an endangered species. I guess the burning owl is too. And of course, the ground doves, you never see them around anymore. Because they have to. And of course, you very seldom ever see a rattlesnake around here. But I was talking to a guy yesterday over in Piney Point, and he said there's still a lot of rattlesnakes over there.
Being from up north, someone once told me that an alligator can get up and run for a...
Well, according to us, he could outrun us because we never got that close to him.
But this is what I was told. I find it hard to believe that.
Well, the problem with alligators, I've fished around alligators all my life in freshwater. I've never been bothered with one. But the problem with alligators is that they love little dogs and little cats and rabbits and stuff. And if you don't ever want to keep a dog, a small dog in particular, or a rabbit or a cat, because the dog will go out there. I've seen alligators take dogs, go out there and start barking at the alligator. And the alligator can move pretty fast. He can't go very far, but he can move pretty fast. And I think the alligator, of course, for a while the alligator was an endangered species too, you know, in Florida. And at the time he was, I used to fish over in the lakes in the Central Florida State. Those lakes were full of alligators over there. Why they ever made him an endangered species in Florida, I don't even know. Now they pay people to go out and kill him, you know. The ranchers pay people to go out and kill him. Anybody else?
When was it you got street lights out here?
Redora Welch could probably tell you better than I could. I don't think, if I remember correctly, we didn't have too many street lights out here when I was a
The
kid.
70s, I think it was.
Redora, do you remember?
It's before
I
that.
would say about 23, 24, but it wasn't all day long.
Yeah.
They would turn them on until about 10 o'clock in the morning, and you turn them on in the evening.
Well, I knew that. I don't remember street
We
lights.
did have an electric one down here.
Out in Anna Maria, right?
Yes, it was run by an old truck.
That was before
So
mine.
they jacked the truck out,
Right.
and they put a belt on it, and they did all the things that you did with electricity, whatever it is. And it didn't run very far, but then they just on Pine Street mostly.
Right.
I know we had electricity and everything, but now then there were no street lights.
Right. I don't remember
Street lights
street lights.
came along when Florida Power, whatever you should call Florida Power.
Turn it off?
I don't remember.
They put street lights in.
Door in the way.
But talking about what we used to do, we used to have what they call the Iceman. He used to come out every morning. And he carried ice, he carried milk, he carried bread, he carried the morning paper, and if you knew him well enough, moonshine and believer tickets. It was a Manti Ice and Cold Storage, who I played for their softball team in the later years, the Hall family.
Well, John, do you remember when we had the ice plant out here?
Yeah, no, I don't remember. I know that the ice plant was there when I was here, but I don't remember it in
Where the
operation.
city hall is.
Yeah, right where the city hall is. Yeah. No, I
We
don't remember.
had the rail plant first,
Right.
then we had the ice plant, and the ice was white. It was made with sulfur water, it wasn't even cold.
And also, this Iceman delivered water too. Because unless y'all have been brought up in sulfur water, which we were, you get a lot of kidney problems with it, you know, kidney stones and stuff. And we used to stick it in the ice box. We pour it in there and let it sit there overnight. Remember, and let the gases get out of the.
We didn't, I liked it, I still.
You liked it anyway.
I don't like water that doesn't have any flavor.
But people always, well, it wasn't the flavor so much as it was the smell. You know, the smell of good body.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holmes.
Okay.
This was really.
Oh, I'm sorry.